And King Solomon made a navy of ships on the shore of the Red Sea. And they came to Ophir and fetched from thence gold, 420 talents. So King Solomon exceeded all the kings of the earth for riches and for wisdom.
Ophir, lost land of fabulous riches. For centuries, men debated the biblical account and the source of Solomon's wealth. Africa, an unknown continent within easy reach of his navies, provided one answer. Here, in towns like Zanzibar along the East African coast, Arab merchants in the 10th century and then the Portuguese in the 16th came to trade. In the harbours and bazaars, they heard extraordinary tales of what lay inland.
In the middle of this country is a fortress built of large and heavy stones inside and out. The people of these lands say that these are the ruins of the factory of Solomon, whence he procured a great quantity of gold. The natives of the country call all these edifices Zimbabwe.
The myth of Ophir in Africa was to spread throughout Europe, often becoming more fantastic, more exotic with the retelling. Yet in practice, the interior of this part of southern Africa, the source of all the tales, was to remain a blank to Europeans. That is, until 1871, when an eager young German entered the area between the Limpopo and Zambezi rivers. The one ambition of that young man, Karl Mauch, was to join the ranks of the great African explorers.
I feel that I possess the power to accomplish useful deeds. I am of good health and have everything necessary for a journey among Kaffir tribes.
His career was to be a short one, but what he was to find were the most famous ruins in Africa south of the Sahara. A city of stone in a land supposedly of mud huts, a place that he believed turned the myth of Solomon's Ophir into visible truth. In 1865, he landed in Natal, southern Africa. For 5 years, he travelled and mapped along the northern limits of the area colonized by Europeans, until he reached Botshabelo in the Transvaal. Here, in this fortified mission station under the Prussian flag, he met another German, the Reverend Alexander Merensky, whose house lay within the fortress walls. Local people had often come to Merensky with stories of ancient ruins that lay far to the north. Chief Sekukuni of the Bapedi tribe said that he had seen beyond the Limpopo River a great city built in stone. In the months he spent with Merensky and his family, Mauch became more and more intrigued by these tales. For both men, the stories pointed to only one thing. Within reach lay the ancient biblical kingdom of Ophir. Here at last was a goal worthy of a true explorer. They planned an expedition together, north across the Limpopo. But when it came to it, Merensky found he couldn't leave. Mauch would have to make the journey alone. The last few days before he left seemed to have been an emotional time for the two homesick Germans. From Europe, news was just coming in of their country's triumphs in the Franco-Prussian War. After the weeks of planning and preparation, success in his journey north became for Mauch a patriotic obligation.
I shall make it my highest duty to add honor to the name of the German nation. In the sight of the reunited fatherland and with the image of the Kaiser adorned with victory, may now the most valuable, the hitherto most mysterious part of Africa be tackled. Ophir, may God help me.
By August 1871, Mauch and his party had reached the Limpopo, now the border between South Africa and Zimbabwe. He was the only white man amongst an ungainly group of 40 people, only 10 of whom, an interpreter and porters, he really needed. The rest of his fellow travellers were hangers-on from villages he'd passed on the way.
And then he talks about a north-eastern bend in the river. Is that right?
That's right.
I have picked up his route with a local hunter and ranch owner, Ray Sparrow.
This is the spot that we're camped at the moment. The indigenous people would have chosen this area because of the narrow crossing, the large sandbank.
So this had always been a traditional crossing point for the local people he was with?
I believe so, yes. I believe it's been a crossing point since antiquity.
And it doesn't seem as if they actually stopped by the river. Is there any particular reason why they'd carry on and get out of this area?
I would think that they would have crossed the river, possibly around midday, and headed north. Porters would obviously have some knowledge of northern country and possibly relatives and knowing of a good camping site. This is what I would think. They would have got away from the river.
Working from his notebooks and the maps Mauch himself drew, we can follow almost his exact route. Today, it takes a four-wheel drive vehicle to tackle the terrain. Mauch had to labour through here on foot.
Friday, the 11th August. North by northeast. Monotonous, flat, the country is poor in water, inanimate. Marching becomes a veritable torture, and so as to leave the region quickly behind, one has to be on one's feet from morning until evening.
Then this whole area of what is now southeastern Zimbabwe was completely uncharted. But Mauch had trained himself as a map maker, knowing his life might depend on finding his way out if things went wrong.
Wednesday, the 16th August, 1 hour at 2.5 miles an hour north to the Nuanetsi, a sand river about 200 paces width, with very little water. On a favorable rock in the center of the river, noonday reading, 103 degrees, 32 minutes. Error plus 21,6, therefore latitude 21 degrees, 29 minutes, 22 seconds south.
By taking a sighting of the sun at midday, we can check our own progress against his, using a box sextant just as he did. He'd carefully chosen all his instruments. His sextant, compass and barometer all had to be small enough to fit into his pocket. His sextant, though, was to give him problems, and explains why his mapping was not always accurate. It was damaged when dropped by one of his porters. After this, he would never let his instruments be carried by any black man. As the journey wore on, illness and his sense of isolation were to take their toll. Mauch's diaries began to reveal the unpleasant side of his nature.
Lemondo is of an uncouth appearance, and his face is almost animal-like. Swollen lips, small, cruel eyes. His behavior matches fully one's expectations. I believe he would make a perfect character to portray a cannibal. I can hardly doubt the opinion of one of my companions that he actually is one.
We just would have it. Let's lift this up. Take it away.
Such a dislike of black people was common enough among colonists then. But for a man so dependent upon his guides, Mauch made little effort to understand them. He hardly even bothered to learn their languages.
You know what we said? We told that you were holding the clouds up.
I remained by the banks of the Nuanetsi with a view to hunting, but without result. Only one Harris buck and one zebra have been killed by the many hunters who comprise my party. What is this for 40 Kaffirs?
He's always complaining, though, that he's not having much success. I mean, at the end of every day, there's no game. Did he have other things with him? I mean, did he have biltong? Did he have dried meat? That would seem quite...
There's no reason why he shouldn't have had. I get the impression some of these travelers and explorers in those early times weren't terribly efficient. I can assure you that I wouldn't starve even today, where there's so much less game. Let's reflect on the time. It would have been the end of the winter, and the hot season would not have been on yet. There should have been feed in the granaries. I don't think that the Shona people weren't a hostile people. They weren't an aggressive people. I see no reason why one couldn't have a glorious time moving steadily north, no particular objective in terms of time. You camped at the next water, you camped at the next village, as the case may be. Who could ask for better?
Every evening, hungry or not, he would write up his journal and plot his progress northwards with the help of nautical tables and an almanac. So far, he had had no further information about where the ruins might be. But from what Morensky had told him back at the mission, he should now be only some 50 miles short. Mauch's companions would sleep out in the open. He himself lay under a large umbrella, little protection against predators. Today, there are other, very different predators. 2 weeks before we camped here, a night raid by terrorists on a nearby ranch left 17 people dead. By day, snakes are the only real problem. Mauch too wore thick leather boots. Leather, he decided, was the material for the bush, and he designed himself a complete buckskin suit, which he wore all the time.
At long last, our troop begins to move, each porter carrying his pack on the head or on the shoulder. I myself march in the rear to keep a watchful eye on anyone who, perhaps, would like to escape. They fairly run on the well-trodden footpath. Thursday, the 17th August, north through fine Mopani forest. No water, no game. The country from here, as far as the first coppice on the granite region, is desolate. Even the baobabs appear to me as a peculiar tree that can in no way be called beautiful. Plump, gnarled, disproportioned in the number and shape of branches, half dead.
By the time they reached the Tokwe River, the men Mauch had hired from south of the Limpopo had returned home. With mountainous country ahead, Ray and his men also had to turn back. I and a single guide will now continue on foot.
Well, David. Bye-bye. Thanks a lot. This is goodbye, is it? And good luck. I think you know your way.
No, we don't. We're straight over, right? And then
That's right. You're going to be off on that way through the mountains and on up to Zimbabwe.
Okay. We're off, right?
Yeah.
At this point, Mauch had to take on local porters who, from the start, he didn't trust. He had only 9 people with him now. He'd also lost his interpreter, and the few words of Matabele that he did speak would not help him much in Shona country.
What's the first thing you say to say how do you do or hello?
You say Makadini.
Makadini?
Makadini.
Makadini.
Yes.
Then, to carry on the conversation, what will they say? What are they going to say back to me?
They say Tiripo Makadiniwo.
Chiripo?
Tiripo
Tiripo?
Makadiniwo.
Macadamia. What does that mean?
It means, how are you? We are right, and how are you?
Right, so what do I say then back to them?
You say shakanaka.
Shakanaka?
Shakanaka. Clap hands.
Clap hands?
Yes, shakanaka.
What does that mean? Shakanaka?
Shakanaka, yes, shakanaka.
Which way do you clap? Just straight? Or
Yeah, like that.
Like that?
High kopias emerge in great irregularity up to 1,000 foot above the plain. Now as bare bell shapes, then as broken and wonderfully wooded mountains from which clear waters descend in plenty. Now everything was alive again. Fertile soil in which maize stalks grow to extraordinary height and circumference. Well-fed goats and fat sheep. Clean-looking, glossy cows showed that the climate and the food were agreeing with them.
This was now the country of the Banyai tribe, where Merensky had been told the ruins lay. But here, near the village of Chief Shumba, Mauch was to find himself in trouble. He had set up camp and lit himself a large bonfire so that he could keep an eye on his porters. But then, rather stupidly, he went off to fetch some water. When he got back, he found that half his goods had gone and his porters had disappeared. He was left alone as dusk fell, guarding what remained of his possessions and feeling, probably for the first time, a real sense of fear.
I kept watch with the rifle cocked and hearing and sight exerted so as to distinguish any suspect sound. Wrapped in my woolen blanket, I sat through the whole night at my post without being relieved of the fearful uncertainty of the fact that the next moment a poisoned arrow could well bring my life to an end. My position was desperate, and it was therefore not surprising when the thought occurred to me to lay hands on my own life before I would succumb after slow torture.
Some shadows of Mauch's misfortunes seemed to affect my own predicament. Onismus, my guide, was spirited away in the night. He was arrested for insulting the local police and spent the next few days in jail. So in the morning I had to carry on as best I could on my own, in search of the highest mountain in the region, once inhabited by Chief Mapanzuri. He was the most powerful chief in the area and had been keeping an eye on Mauch's progress. He sent some of his men to fetch Mauch and bring him to his village on a lofty peak called Zhou.
You speak English?
Yeah.
You speak English? You don't speak English?
I know.
Is the hill up there, is that Zhou? Over there?
Yeah.
Zhou?
Nakona.
And Chief Mapansuri, does he live up there?
Ahako.
Huh?
Urikuku.
No? You
No.
don't? Ishe Mapansuri Varikupi?
Varikuku.
Oh.
Okakuna. Varikuku.
He lives down there? Nobody's up there?
Aye.
But not over there?
Nakona.
No?
Aye.
So can we go and see Chief Mapansuri?
Yeah.
Okay, well done.
In the village of the modern Chief Mapanzuri, where I hope to spend the night, life is much as it was 100 years ago. The traditional courtesies extended to a chief are still the same.
Can you give those to the chief? Because there is a present.
I found myself disappointed in the person of Mapansuri, for instead of a vivacious, strong man, I saw a small, old little man, almost hidden underneath a homemade bark cloth, a picture of ruin and poverty. Any conversation, of course, was out of the question, for I had no interpreter and nobody understood Matabele.
How long they've been living down here in this village?
We've stayed here for a long time. They once lived on top of the hills, and this was long time ago.
Like many other people in this area, they had been forced up onto the hilltops to defend themselves against raiding war parties of Matabele.
He talks of his grannies having many wives and over 100 sons.
So what relation is the chief who lived up on the hill with the Chief Mapanzuri today? Is he his grandfather, or can he explain that?
He was the great-granny of him. He owned this name, Mapanzuri. The name was transmitted from son to son until today he is the chief as well.
Can you ask him, do they have any memory of a white man travelling through here on his own, who visited the chief on the hill?
But there is this one white man that came here, and he says our parents talk of him, and he is known to have been a traveler that came here. They nicknamed him Mapasure because he was a traveler. Mapasure means
Just
a
the
traveler, yes.
Well,
So
mysterious name. Not Mapansuri, Mapasuri.
Mapasure, not Mapanzure. Yeah.
How different the treatment was now. I was regaled with rice, porridge, meat and beer, and the contrast in the space of time between night and midday in relation to my situation was equal to that of darkness and light.
But Mauch soon found that his host expected him to remain in his village as his white man, a permanent guest, in reality as a prisoner.
Should I agree, I condemned myself to a pitiful life. Should I disagree, I risked the danger of losing my life, but, as in any case it was already in the balance, everything, even the most improbable, had to be tried. I learned that a white man who, regrettably, belongs to the German nation and has sunk to the state of a Kafir by marrying 2 black women, lived with another independent chief at a distance of about 3 hours. Only he could help me. A few lines were put down on paper and sent off.
The following day, the disreputable German arrived, and Mauch had to swallow his contempt. For the man, Adam Renders, prized Mauch from Mapanzuri's grasp and led him off to his hut in the nearby village of Chief Beaker. From Renders, Mauch now heard that in a nearby valley there were large ruins. He wanted to set off straight away, but Renders counselled patience. Mauch was an outsider. He couldn't just stroll in there. Once more, he needed Renders' help, needed to make use of the thing he most despised, Renders' integration into the native community. Chief Beaker's descendants still live in almost exactly the same place that their forefathers did. Though like Mapanzuri, they've now settled next to their farmlands in the valley.
On arrival at the homestead, Adam Renders produced a large beer pot. The beer is of pleasant taste and cool temperature, as he had it brought from his ice cellar. The chief arrived with several of his sons, and an animated conversation began.
Why are there so many people here? And why is all the beer being drunk? Is there a particular reason?
Yes. We have to do it after doing a piece of work in the field, or after doing work here in the home. So we come together and we drink this beer to thank people who have helped me.
Do people in your village remember a white man who came through here and stayed at the village?
Yes.
And what was his name?
Saddam.
Saddam.
Yes.
Because the man's name was Adam Renders. So Saddam must be what people called him.
It may be.
Where would they have lived then? Would they have been at that time up on the hill?
Yes.
So
They were living on top of the hill.
On the hill. So that's where he would have been. Chigaramboni?
Yes.
Chigaramboni. What does that mean, Chigaramboni?
Mboni is the eye. Kugara is to sit. So there was a man who used to sit on top of the mountain.
Look out.
Look out to see what danger comes.
This, they say, was where Renders lived, Renders' hut. And you can still see remains of the original red clay floor, or dugger as it's called locally. There's pottery strewn all around, and even large lumps of what were originally the walls of the hut. To all intents and purposes, he was living as a local tribesman. Some archaeologists who were interested in the story dug here a few years ago and found European items, such as a bit of an old boot, buttons, a buckle, glass trade beads, which do suggest that this was indeed where Renders lived. Mauch himself had a hut built nearby, and they lived together as neighbours. From here, a few days later, the impatient Mauch was taken to a vantage point and permitted his first tantalizing glimpse of the ruins.
Bravo! This is what I have been seeking. Only a few days ago I was occupied with serious thoughts of death. Today I stand... May God be praised. The 5th September, 1871. Early in the morning we started for the ruins. We were led along a little valley at the foot of a hill, about 400 feet high, which was regarded by all with great awe.
Though Renders had cleared the way, Mauch's presence here was still a delicate matter. Much depended on the goodwill of the chief who lived on the hill. But as Mauch waited in the valley below, he noticed behind him the overgrown ruins of what appeared to be a large building.
A kind of footpath led over rubble into the interior. Inside ran huge, arc-like, labyrinthine walls.
He knew he was intruding. Perhaps this was some forbidden, sacred place that he didn't understand. But he was drawn on by the magnificence of what he saw.
I came to a halt in front of a tower-like structure, apparently quite undamaged.
But he was stopped in his tracks by a call from outside. The chief had come down from the mountain to lead them across the valley and up the hill to where his huts lay.
I went through a narrow entrance between boulders into the interior of the ruins. After prolonged wandering over and between rocks and rubble, after troublesome and dangerous pushing through dense undergrowth, I came to the definite conclusion that these ruins must be the fallen remains of a very strong fortification of earlier times. As it was already past sunset, it was necessary to remain on the mountain for the night. The chief turned out to be a very friendly fellow, which was a consolation. He did not appear to be upset at all by our inquisitiveness. He even made us a present of a goat ram. The name of the hill with the ruins is, they say, Zimbabwe, or possibly Zimbabwe. It is without doubt that these are the ruins sought by Merensky. But no further information about the when and how could be obtained.
As dawn broke, Mauch began to realize just how extraordinary these ruins were. The sheer scale of everything, and the way the walls were built on and around the boulders. Eagerly, he set about recording everything in his journal.
All the walls, without exception, are built of cut granite stones without any mortar. The most remarkable wall stands on the edge of a precipice and is, strangely, still very well preserved, up to a height of about 30 feet.
To his European eyes, it appeared to be some kind of fortress, but there were other elements which suggested something more mysterious.
At several places, there protrude from the walling stone beams of 8 to 10 feet in length. They are sunk several feet deep in the walls, for they can hardly be moved.
The jumbled remains on the hill made little sense to him. He was tempted back to the mighty ruins in the valley below.
It's about 600 yards distant from the mountain, and was probably connected with the mountain by extensive wallings to which many ruined walls testify. The outer wall of this rondeau, about 150 yards in diameter and lying in the plain, is the best preserved one. Those inside are neither as high nor as thick as the outer ring wall. I stumbled on over masses of rubble and parts of walls. In the southern part, there stands the tower, built up to about 30 feet, at the base cylindrical and at the upper half conical in shape. Nowhere could signs of a walled-up entrance be discovered. An ascent to the summit by means of creepers taught me that it is not hollow, but filled with small stones. The outer wall of the rondeau shows an attempt to place the granite stones in a decorative pattern. This ornamentation is 20 feet from the ground and has been constructed on a third part of the southern wall on either side of the tower. Otherwise, everything is rubble and buried in ruins and thick undergrowth.
Mauch was no archaeologist, and in any event did not wish to upset the local people by digging in the ruins. Instead, the surveyor in him took over. He tried to record what he could, ready for that moment when he would break the news to the world.
Neither on top of the mountain nor down in the plain could I notice any inscription. Nothing showed itself which would have supplied me with an answer as to whom these mysterious buildings had to be attributed.
At a loss he may have been to begin with, but Mauch spent 9 months with renders at Beaker's village, waiting for the rainy season to end before he could continue his journey out to the coast. In the ample time that he had, he gradually began to come up with some extraordinary answers.
The local inhabitants are absolutely convinced that the ruins were built by white people long ago when the stones were soft. How else, they say, could they have formed them into regular brick-like shapes?
But who were these white people? An old man told him of ceremonies that had once been held on the hill.
The similarities of these sacrifices to those practiced among the Israelites is unmistakable. It is now beyond doubt that the Jewish religion has been kept alive here for almost 3,000 years.
The final entry in Mauch's journal, which mentions the ruins, for the 6th of March, 1872, reads like this. Today I dare to close this account with, the Queen of Sheba is the Queen of Zimbabwe.
Relying on this, I believe that I do not err when I suppose that the ruin on the mountain is an imitation of the Solomonic temple on Mount Moriah. The ruin on the plain, a copy of that palace in which the Queen of Sheba dwelled during her visit to Solomon.
Mauch had been suffering from recurring bouts of malaria for some time, and you might imagine that these conclusions were the ramblings of a feverish mind. But what his final verdict essentially was nothing surprising or original. It was based almost entirely on what Morenski had told him, and ultimately on the Arab tales and the theories of the Portuguese. Morenski had said that in this part of Africa, the ancient Ophir of Solomon was to be found. Mauch, slightly naive, but an ambitious man seeking glory for his country, and above all perhaps for himself, was quite happily persuaded that he was the person who'd solved a centuries-old mystery. 100 years on, and it became clear that Mauch had solved nothing. It had never even occurred to him that the original architects of the ruins might have been African. His confused notions were taken up by the ideologists of white supremacy. That supremacy, when challenged by militant black nationalism, meant the real truth of the nation's past would become caught up in the battle for its future. The newly independent state took its name from its most famous ruins, Zimbabwe. But the first white settlers who followed Mauch north across the Limpopo never dreamt of a black Zimbabwe nation, past or future. As their wagons rolled into the area, the site fast became a tourist attraction. Visitors were amazed that such ruins could exist in Africa. As pioneers carving out an African homeland for themselves, they could only presume that the builders must have been an earlier people just like them, intrepid colonists from another country, another continent. The first people to investigate the site who claimed to be archaeologists were just well-meaning amateurs. The best known of these was R.N. Hall, a journalist. He did make some remarkable finds, including the most magnificent of the Zimbabwe birds. These mysterious sculptures in soapstone would have become the most powerful, popular symbols of Great Zimbabwe as it had become known. But to Hall, objects like this could not be African things. He did not talk so romantically of Solomon and Sheba, but the builders for him were fair-skinned people who had come from the Bible land some 1,000 years before Christ. Convinced he was right, he dug up and threw away anything he thought African, labeling it the degenerate leftovers of more recent tribal squatters. The visible remains of the white people, the walls, he had restored to how he thought they should have been, with entrances wide and open in rather Near Eastern style, despite the evidence of his eyes that originally they were very different. Into the chaos left by Hall came the first professional archaeologist, David Randall McIver. There were few areas left to dig, but he still found enough to startle Hall and the colonial establishment. Everything McIver found, and he dug here right the way down to bedrock, he felt was by nature African, sherds of pottery like this, made in a similar way for centuries. The only evidence of outside influence he came across was in looking at the objects that Hall had dug up. Persian pottery like this, fragments of Arab glass. There were only very few of these things, and they could easily be explained as luxury items which had been traded in from the Arab towns on the east coast. What was most important about them was that they could be dated to the 13th or the early 14th century AD. This medieval date would put paid to any possible link with Solomon and Sheba. For all who were to follow McIver, the facts lacked romance but were clear enough. There was no need to look outside Africa for an answer to Great Zimbabwe. But for most white Rhodesians, this seemed absurd, inconceivable, and the myths were kept very much alive.
We can weave in our imagination pictures of what might have taken place on this eerie spot. The caravan of Solomon leaves the desert oasis and hastens on its way to Ophir. The dancing girls bend and sway in rhythm before the lovely guest and the ancient king whose minds are somewhere in the hinterland of Africa. Did the messengers of Solomon arrive in this valley to collect the riches from the great fortress of stone? And did this priest hear their coming? Ghost-like figures invest the temple area. Beneath the conical tower, a figure reveals itself. What is that which is cast within the monolith's shadow? And what does this movement signify? Is a sacrifice about to be made? Inscrutable face, as baffling as these inscrutable walls.
But by the 1960s, very little was still inscrutable. Radiocarbon dating proved any biblical date for the site impossible. All that was left for the whites was increased defiance. Though they did shift their ground and juggle their dates a little.
Zimbabwe was not built by either blacks or whites. Zimbabwe was built in approximately 570 AD, long before blacks or whites were here. It was a virtual replica of the Temple of the Moon Goddess, which is in southern Arabia, and which was built about 750 BC. The people who built it were Semitic. They were brown in color, and were evidently the Sabaean people, who were a mixture of Arabs and Jews. The queen of Sheba was the queen of the Sabaeans.
The strength of this white rearguard was because the stakes were getting much higher, the political importance of the ruins greater. But by the 1970s, the argument was settled. The whole academic world was of one mind. Great Zimbabwe had been built by a highly organized and sophisticated black people. For those leading black freedom fighters in the bush, this was of immense symbolic morale-boosting significance.
Great Zimbabwe, of course, to us it is the a living memory of what our history as a people stands for. It is a reminder of a greatness that our people once were capable of, and a greatness which they're still capable of.
What for so long blinded European eyes to that African greatness was the very nature of the architecture at Great Zimbabwe. For whites, this suggested the castles and cities of a world nearer home, products of a sophisticated technology. In fact, these structures had evolved from very simple beginnings. The people of the region had always had building materials to hand. The natural stone is granite, which breaks off the outcrops in ideal brick-like chunks. The first builders at the site experimented by placing rocks between boulders. The result was a crude, dry stone wall. In time, larger walls were built on and between the boulders on the hill. Eventually, down on the valley floor, developed the very finest freestanding walls. Even this, the most magnificent architecture here, was still achieved without mortar or bonding. It had all been a simple learning process. But the walls alone make little sense unless they are seen within their original African context. These were not the walls of buildings, but merely enclosures thrown around groups of typically African daga or clay huts with roofs of thatch. Over time, further enclosing walls were added, and they grew in scale. They were the result of Great Zimbabwe's increasing wealth and power, based on agriculture, but above all on its control over the trade routes, carrying gold from the interior to the Arab towns on the coast. Great Zimbabwe became a true city by the end of the 15th century. The hill would have been the preserve of the ruler or chief and his entourage. Below, between the hill and the great enclosure, were his people, some 10,000 living in simple daga huts. But can we now imagine how this society worked? Aspects of African village life today may provide some clues. The Venda people are thought by some to be distant descendants of the builders of Great Zimbabwe. A group of Venda women have come to pay homage to their chief. They're kept waiting, while one of them is allowed to go up to the mountain through a complex ritual route, as narrow and tortuous as the passageways on the hill at Great Zimbabwe. In his inner sanctum, the chief holds court amongst his elders. The messenger arrives, and elaborate, formal approaches are made.
azoluka awutazi naningi good.
The chief agrees to come down and honor the dancers with his presence. The Venda still maintain the tradition of building in elaborately painted and moulded daga, very similar, as research has shown, to how Great Zimbabwe would have looked within its walls.
Vane nichita kitu chanu nichita nga utihi mbilaru. Izone zinenda koni.
By looking at tribes such as the Venda, people are still searching for insights into the past. Insights which can also be provided by oral evidence, myths, traditions and explanations tribal people today can offer. But oral evidence is often contradictory and misleading. In fact, Mauch himself was told that the great enclosure was called the House of the Great Woman. For him, this had to mean the Queen of Sheba. Some anthropologists now believe that it was where the chief's wives lived. But the true purpose of the great enclosure remains perhaps the most puzzling of the many mysteries of Great Zimbabwe. For anyone wandering through here, there are things about it that must have had a powerful symbolic significance. Were these symbols of power? Was their purpose simply religious? Still, no one has any precise answer. Great Zimbabwe fell apart about the middle of the 15th century. Exactly why is not known. Then smaller states to the west and the north took over, trading in similar ways, building in stone in comparable but in not such a grand manner as here. But by the 1870s, when Mauch arrived in the area, such complex societies no longer existed. He came here after centuries of tribal movement, warfare and confusion. Contact with the distant past had been completely ruptured. Local people were by this time so demoralized that they could not believe their ancestors had been capable of building Great Zimbabwe. Mauch finally left Beaker's village in May 1872. He arrived on the coast in a wretched frame of mind. His journals show fits of depression, even of hatred, not just for blacks, but for the colonial whites as well. He boarded a ship and left for good the continent he'd dreamed of as a child. He had held out such high hopes for Africa, but it had all proved too hard. Back in Germany, he never received the recognition he felt he deserved. Malaria continued to affect him. He couldn't get on with people, he found it difficult to hold down a job. In the end, malaria probably killed him. In 1875, during a bout of fever, he fell to his death from the balcony of his home. He was only 37 years old.